In the video where we talked about the top 10 tips, you will remember that we discussed the difference between message sent and message received. In the workplace, one of the areas where the difference between message sent and message received can be very detrimental is feedback. No organization can operate without people giving one another feedback. It just doesn't work. But the question becomes, is the feedback received or understood the way it was meant? Well, when we're dealing with feedback between culturally different people, the answer is quite often the message is received differently from the way it was meant. How do we get to that point? Well, this is what we're going to look at this point. So feedback, well, you all know that we can give people negative feedback. We can also give them positive feedback. So we can represent feedback like an axis. Somewhere in the middle, you must have 0. So the idea of this diagram is the farther a point is from 0, the stronger the message is. A point all the way to the right implies you are doing an amazing job. Such a good job that we will give you a raise, a bonus, a promotion, an award, something good's going to happen. On the opposite side, obviously it means the opposite. You are doing a terrible job. We're so bad that we will demote you, fire you, put you on a performance improvement plan, send you back home if you're an expat, something like this. Around 0 is what I call neutral feedback. Somebody says something, but you have no idea whether they mean it positively or negatively. In the English language, the most famous sentence in that is the most famous neutral sentence is, it's interesting. If you're a newcomer, pay attention. If one of your Canadian coworkers says, it's interesting with a flat tone of voice, it means nothing. Okay? You have to wait for the next sentence to know whether they mean it positively or negatively. Other ways of saying nothing with words include good point. I didn't think of it that way. It's a good first try. You're doing fine. I'll think about it. Maybe later. Thank you for sharing. Thank you for your input. None of this means anything. Well, one I tried to use with my wife is, you look different. Okay, so as I'm sure most men will understand what I was trying to do at that point, I was trying to say nothing with words when she asked me, how's my hair or something like this. Doesn't work anywhere in the world, okay? Now, if you've worked with people, you've quickly realized that some people are more sensitive to feedback than others. Some people, you gotta go easy on them, otherwise they get all flustered. And others, gotta hit them a bit more strongly for the message to sink in. Well, my experience is we have the same phenomenon at the cultural level. So relative to Canada, there's a large number of cultures, including cultures that the average Canadian tends to think of as being close to us. So by this I mean the United States, the United Kingdom, Australia, New Zealand, Ireland, South Africa, okay? And more generally, people from all these kind of cultures. Fundamentally, what happens? Well, slightly negative feedback from the average Canadian sounds neutral to people in these countries on average. And conversely, slightly negative feedback by these countries' standards sounds blasting to the average Canadian. Let me give you concrete examples, because otherwise it's kind of theoretical. Every zoo around the world has somewhere a sign that asks visitors not to feed the animals. My question to you is, well, how does the staff word the sign? Because in pretty much every zoo, a committee was formed. They decided, okay, what are we going to write on the sign? So in the Toronto Zoo, the sign says this: please refrain from feeding the animals for the following reasons. Then bullet points, you have 5 reasons. First one, if you give them food with a wrapper, they might choke on it. Second one, they might get germs from your hands. Third one, they won't be hungry for the food prepared by the nutritionists. Then there's 2 more reasons which I forgot. Then the sign concludes, for these reasons, we appreciate your collaboration in not feeding the animals. Thank you. That is a very Canadian sign. What makes it so Canadian is, 1, it's very polite. Please and thank you. 2, we explain all the reasons why you shouldn't do it. And 3, who suffers the consequences? Well, it's the animals. There is no consequence on that sign for the person who gives the food to the animals. Same sign, but now we're in a zoo in France. In the zoo next to my parents' place, the sign says this: "It is strictly forbidden under no circumstance to feed the animals. Violators will be expelled immediately and fined." That, to French people, means don't do it. Now, what's the problem? Well, if I'm used to it's strictly forbidden under no circumstance to do X, and I see a sign that says, "Please refrain from feeding the animals for all these reasons," what does that sign mean to me? Well, to me it means they prefer I don't do it. But if I wash my hands, remove the wrapper, and don't give them too much, it's okay. So you see, the message that the sign sent is very different from the message I ended up receiving. And this, unfortunately, happens in many Canadian organizations, particularly with verbal feedback that Canadian managers will give to recent immigrants, and the message will be heard. People understand every word, but they do not understand that their manager wants them to change their behaviors. And on the other side, I and many other immigrants have blasted our Canadian co-workers with negative feedback, which was received far more negatively than it was intended. So the one situation we have seen all across Canada goes like this. Somebody's presenting data. Somebody in the audience disagrees with one of the numbers. How will the audience member handle it? Well, if this audience member is the average Canadian, he or she will typically choose between two options. Option one, say nothing. Wait until the end of the presentation and go talk to the presenter one-on-one. Option two, if he or she decides, I need to bring it up during the presentation, then the average Canadian will raise his or her hand and start by apologizing. So he or she will say, "Excuse me," or "I'm sorry." Then, when given the floor, they will say something like this. They'll phrase it as a question. "How did you arrive at this number? I may have missed your assumptions. How did you calculate it?" Same situation, but now the person who disagrees with the number is the average South African, Nigerian, Egyptian, Israeli, French, Dutch, German, Pole, Romanian, Russian, Indian, Pakistani, Iranian, Syrian, or Venezuelan. What will they say? Well, they'll choose usually between three options. You're wrong, that's wrong, I disagree. What impact will you have on the average Canadian presenter if you say, "You're wrong, that's wrong," or "I disagree"? Well, it will be received far more negatively than it was intended. Trust me on this one, because unfortunately I've done it enough times. If you say "you're wrong" to one of your coworkers in front of their peers in the middle of their presentation, you will get no collaboration from them for the next 6 months if that person is the average Canadian. Okay? On the other side, we have East Asia or Mexico. Slightly negative feedback by Japanese or Korean standards sounds neutral to the average Canadian. Slightly negative feedback by Canadian standards sounds blasting to the average Mexican or Chinese. So the best example I can give you of this dynamics was what happened to us when I was working for Xerox. So when I was working for Xerox, we had conference calls with Fuji Xerox at least once a week. And the way this one played out was, during the conference call, we would ask them a question along the lines of, "Can you guys do X?" And when this dynamics got us into trouble, the answer after the long silence, and if you remember the video on silence, that was not unusual, but after the long silence, when this got us into trouble, what we heard was something like this. It's going to be a little difficult. Okay, so what does that mean? What does a little difficult mean? To the average Canadian, a little difficult means doable with some effort. So we got into troubleshooting mode. We started to ask them questions. Well, what's the issue? How can we overcome it? And so on. By the end of the call, we thought we had a solution. Nothing happened. And over time, we started to notice a pattern. Every time they said a little difficult, nothing happened afterwards. So eventually, we decided to ask a Canadian guy who had taught English in Japan, "You know, when Japanese people say a little difficult, what do they mean?" His answer was, Does it come after yes? Then it means forget it. Not in a million years. You see, if a Japanese person tells a group of Japanese in Japanese a little difficult, they all know nothing's going to happen. But you translate that into English and you get a totally different message. So again, huge difference between message sent and message received. Now you will notice that I am focusing all our collective attention on the negative side. Why? Well, if you're an employee or a service provider and you get positive feedback from your boss or your client, and you misinterpret how happy your client or boss is, what happens? Usually, not much. Over time, you may feel underappreciated, or you may think you're going to get a bigger raise than you end up getting, but there is no consequence short term. Why is it so important as an employee or a service provider to understand how unhappy your manager or client is? Well, the unhappier my manager is, the more corrective action I will need to take as an employee, and the faster I will need to take that corrective action. Okay? Fundamentally, feedback means you need to change. And the unhappier the feedback giver is, the more corrective action the feedback receiver should take. So then it begs a very important question. How do we know how unhappy our managers or clients are? Well, that depends on their cultural background. So, and this is one area where many immigrants run into a lot of difficulties in Canadian organizations because they misunderstand the indicators that Canadian managers or clients use to tell them how unhappy they are with their performance. And this is what we're going to look at in detail in the next slide.